Speaking of other developments in the gun world, talking about rulings getting struck down, you just gave us a good update in a piece this week about the latest ruling to target President Biden's ATF rule that tries to go after so-called ghost guns. If you want to tell us what happened in this latest ruling.
Yeah, so we wrote about, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, how a federal judge blocked enforcement of President Biden's ghost gun rule against Defense Distributed, which is sort of the company that was kind of a pioneer in the 3D printed gun space and has done a lot in the home CNC machines for finishing firearm parts. And so they've been a big player in the unfinished gun part space. And a couple of weeks ago, they received an injunction that blocks the ATF from enforcing this rule against them. So people can buy the parts from them that the ATF is trying to claim are not legal to sell. And now, a couple of weeks later, that same judge has extended that same protection. It's actually a separate case, but same basic claims, to Polymer80, which is the largest manufacturer of unfinished gun parts in the country. If you've seen, an 80% lower kit, an unfinished firearm receiver kit anywhere basically in the country at any gun show, it's almost certainly made by Polymer80. The P80 will be on the box. They're all over the place. If somebody is out there building a gun from unfinished parts, they're almost certainly using Polymer80. It's extremely popular. And so now the ATF can't enforce this rule against them either. And that includes both the ATF had initially said, well, this is really just for kits. If you sell the unfinished part alongside tools to finish said part, then that is technically a gun now, even though it's obviously not, you can't put it together and make it a functional gun. You'd have to finish the part first. But that was the core of this ruling initially. Then the ATF sent another letter and said, well, actually, also you can't sell the unfinished part itself at all. So they even expanded it beyond the initial scope. And this federal judge says, yeah, you can't do that. You cannot just make up law on your, that's essentially what he's accusing the ATF of doing.
Right. And like we said before, it was just Defense Distributed. Now it's just Polymer80. So it's not as though the rule itself is blocked. But as you point out, because these are pretty much the biggest companies in this space right now, that certainly deals a blow to Biden's attempt to regulate this space, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there were also a couple of other smaller companies that were initially the ones in a case called Vanderstock that had the rule blocked, enjoined against them. And so then Defense Distributed came in and got their name added. And now Polymer80 has come in with their own separate suit and effectively had their name added to the list of companies that the ATF can't go after for their ghost gun rule. And now that list is, it's sort of like if you tried to ban selling bikes and then a judge said, well, okay, you can't enforce this against Walmart or Target or Trek, the largest chain of bike shops in the country. It's like, well, technically there's still a rule here. It hasn't been completely enjoined, but it's all of the major players are now free to sell both the parts and the kits again. And Polymer80 has already started doing that without fear of prosecution from the ATF. And also, I would imagine if they attempted to bring any actual criminal cases against someone else, that this precedent is going to be limiting in what they could actually do on that front, even if it doesn't technically completely enjoin them. Plus, I'd expect that at some point in the near future, this judge is going to rule on a nationwide injunction. He initially rejected doing that, but it seems to me like if you read through this ruling, he talks about how Polymer80 attempted to comply with the rule in good faith. And then the ATF sent out that letter that said basically, never mind, you also can't sell these unfinished parts either. And that would have put them out of business is the claim in the case. And the judge, believed that idea. And so now we have this injunction.
Right. And as speaking of the ATF and putting out letters and their reaction, how have they reacted to this latest ruling? It seems like they're not exactly deterred by it, right?
Yeah. Honestly, it seems like they live in their own fantasy world, the way they reacted to this. As this ruling came out, I believe it was on Sunday. And then on Tuesday, the ATF released an entire advisory that was all about how they're enforcing this ghost gun rule. And you can't, the bottom line was something along the lines of like, you can't sell unfinished parts and then have another business sell, you can't, and then sell tools separately to the same person. Right. But it's like, at this point, what are you guys even, you're just fooling yourselves, right? I mean, it just makes it hard to take ATF seriously. A lot of what they're doing makes it difficult to take them seriously at this point. They're just sort of pushing through with things that they know are not going to stand up in court. I mean, that was the pistol brace ban, right? It was pretty bizarre to watch them go through with that immediately after the bump stock ban, which is justified on essentially the exact same logic, was struck down in the Fifth Circuit. Like these rules are all just sitting there waiting to get struck down, and everyone knows they're going to get struck down. And the ATF is going forward anyway, for what is hard to look at as anything other than political reasons. The president wants them to do this stuff. And so they are, regardless of how it affects their reputation, I think, among, anyone paying attention.
I was going to say, you have to wonder if it is just an attempt to save face, because that's sort of, you saw this when the first iteration of the frame and receiver rule was published, and you started slowly seeing stories come out from maybe media outlets that aren't used to covering this space, talking about how, nothing's changed in the ghost gun market. Why hasn't anything changed? And then the gun control groups got involved and started putting statements out saying that this rule did nothing. And then sure enough, ATF comes out with a letter that says, that rule we published, well, it's actually much broader than we originally said, and you actually can't sell any parts. And you have to wonder if maybe the same thing's happening here. They're receiving blow after blow to the rule, and rather than take more criticism, they're just going to show that they're still tough on this rule. And
I think it's just bizarre. It's bizarre to watch them do this stuff. Like it's hard to come up with any justification beyond just the political influence involved. Because you're right. That's exactly how it happened. They put out the frame and receiver rule, which banned kits. You couldn't sell the tools alongside the unfinished parts, was the bottom line of that rule. And then they got a lot of complaints, and it didn't actually do much to affect the market because, people just started selling the parts by themselves. And then you could find or make your own tools and jigs in other ways. That wasn't really as much of a constraint as the president and gun control advocates obviously wanted it to be. So the ATF just put out a letter that said, never mind. This is, we're completely redoing how we interpret our own rule again, a couple months after we published it. So, and of course, this didn't hold up in court. That's a big part of what this ruling was about. The judge talked about how Polymer80, he first refused to do a nationwide injunction on this rule. And then now he's piecemeal enjoining it against these companies because later on, the ATF went further and essentially made it so that these businesses can't operate at all, and did so in a way that exceeds their authority under federal law. That's really that's the other thing about these cases, is they're not really Second Amendment cases. As much as that might surprise some people, like the core issue here is not the Second Amendment. The core issue is agency power, essentially, the executive agency power, and the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs how far an agency can go in interpreting a federal law. And essentially, the judge said, "You've gone way too far." And part of it was that they pushed this envelope even beyond what they initially intended to. And And yeah, I mean, like you watch them do this stuff, and it's hard to explain any of it beyond just pure politics, right? I mean, why would you issue that pistol brace ruling, which is going to affect way more people than the bump stock ruling did? And why would you issue that right after the bump stock ban was blocked in court? Like, right. You're just going to lose in court. It's hard to see any path where they don't lose in the Fifth Circuit, at least. You know, I guess perhaps they hope that the Supreme Court is going to side with them, but that seems wildly unlikely, especially since, I mean, these lower courts are striking down these rules even without citing Bruin, which is the major Supreme Court Second Amendment case right now, precedent, or EPA, which is the major Supreme Court precedent on limiting federal agency power. They're certainly looking at the Supreme Court to save you from what the Fifth Circuit has done. It doesn't make much sense. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone on any side of the ideological divide that really thinks that these rules are going to last.
Right. I think that's a good point. I was going to say that the current makeup on the Supreme Court is perhaps more skeptical of administrative power than we've had in a very long time. So I think it's a tough stretch to think that they're going to bail out the ATF and right. Getting a capacious ruling on a 1968 gun law that somehow covers pistol braces and frames and receivers and such.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be one thing if they had initially come down on pistol braces being SBRs, or that in 68 when they developed the definition of firearm that it was what it is, what they're trying to make it now. But the other big problem they have is that they initially for decades said that these things weren't illegal. That was also the big problem in the bump stock case. And it's hard to look at this and try to reason through why you would do any of these things outside of the political motivations. I mean, it's very odd to watch the ATF operate this way in such a just blatantly politically influenced way. Like these are not going to stand. I mean, it's just kind of embarrassing, honestly, for them to put out that advisory immediately after their rule was blocked in the vast majority of cases, right? Like, okay, you're putting out this advisory. Who does it even apply to anymore?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, no kidding.
So anyway, yes, the ATF was very much undeterred. But let me give you a quote. I know I've been pretty critical of the NRA, the ATF here. So I'll let Director Dettelbach speak for himself. He said, quote, "People who engage in the business of dealing firearms are subject to the Gun Control Act. That means they need to run background checks and sell guns with serial numbers. That is what the ghost gun rule is about. Today's advisory is simple. If you're dealing firearms, including items that can be readily converted to a working firearm, ATF is going to make sure that you are following the same laws as everyone else." So that was their perspective on why they issued that advisory several days after a judge almost completely gutted the ghost gun rule.
Yeah. It's certainly an interesting choice. As you said, it's hard to see it as anything but a political, face-saving measure. Yeah.
I mean, you can understand why President Biden keeps pushing these things because
right, it's part of his agenda.
That's his agenda. That's his political agenda. I mean, that's what he's believes in. That's what he has advocated for. He doesn't necessarily care if he loses in court. And, you could certainly, the ATF serves at the pleasure of the president to a certain degree, but like, I don't know, they continually are doing things for, it seems, explicitly political reasons. It's hard to come up with any other